the first question. I'll read the Spanish first.
Yeah.
Pranam, he leído una cita de Srila Maharaj del 6 de octubre del 1981 donde él habla de la palabra gracias a un devoto y en un momento dice, el agradecer no suena bien a mis oídos. ¿Qué gratitud puedo mostrar a cambio de lo que he recibido de la gente del Señor? Sobre esto he pensado que quizás cada Vaishnava o Vaishnavi puede tener un sentimiento diferente sobre esta palabra. ¿Es posible que pueda por favor compartir su consideración sobre el uso de la palabra gracias? So it's about, it says, I read an interview to Srila Maharaj from 6 October 1981 where he says that the word thank you, where he talks about the word thank you to a devotee, and at some point he says, thanking doesn't sound well to my ears. What gratitude can I show in exchange to what I've received from the Lord? I've been thinking about this, and that maybe every Vaishnava and Vaishnavi may have a different feeling about this word. Can you share your considerations over the word thank you?
Well, I think that one thing I have found, aside from what Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj has said there, which I'll also comment on, is that it's not that common in India to say thank you.
Una cosa que sí vi, a pesar de lo que dijo Sridhar Maharaj, es que en la India, ya por empezar, no es tan común decir la palabra gracias.
Whereas in other cultures, it may be more common and accepted and expected.
Mientras en otras culturas mucho más común, además se espera que uno diga gracias.
And whether that's connected to what I'm going to say next about Gaudiya Vaishnavism and Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj's perspective, I'm not sure.
Y no estoy seguro si esto está conectado a lo que voy a decir sobre la palabra gracia y sobre lo que dijo Sridhar Maharaj al respecto.
But from the Gaudiya perspective, it's something like what Radha says when she says, those who say I love you know nothing about love.
Sin embargo, desde el punto de vista Gaudiya, es lo mismo de cuando Radha dijo que lo que dicen te amo no saben nada sobre el amor.
Because as soon as you say I love you, there's I and there's you, and there's a difference, whereas love is about two becoming one.
Porque al decir yo te amo, hay un yo y hay un tú, y entonces todavía hay diferencias, mientras el amor es sobre todo la unidad que ocurre.
Of course, the two becoming one is a dynamic one, not a monistic type of a unity.
Los dos que se convierten en uno, por supuesto, es una unidad no monística, sino de forma dinámica.
You could say you and I become we.
Yo y tú, una vez enamorados, nos convertimos en un nosotros.
Similarly, when we say thank you, we're creating some distance.
Asimismo, cuando decimos gracias, creamos una distancia.
And in love, it goes without saying. Thank you goes without saying.
Y en el ámbito del amor, esta gratitud se da por garantizada, no hay que decirlo.
And as such, the voicing of thank you is indicative of not being as close as in love and in circumstances in which it goes without saying.
Y el tener que decir gracias crea esta distancia, como decir que el hecho de tener que decirlo quiere decir que si uno no lo dijera, no sentaría bien.
So Pujapad Sridhar Maharaj was thinking of it along these lines, that it goes without saying, saying thank you creates a distance. I would rather not be distanced from you in that way.
Entonces lo que quiso decir Sridhar Maharaj es que esta gratitud se da por supuesta, no hay que decirlo.
Does that help? So,
Um,
don't say thank you.
Dice que no lo agradezcas. The next question, la siguiente pregunta. Oh, by the way, that was Brajahari. Era de Brajahari. La siguiente es de Subal, Italy. Reverencia, soy un aspirante al Gaudiya Vaishnavismo y a veces me encuentro con devotos igual de aspirantes al Gaudiya Vaishnavismo que luchan con el mundo tratando de establecer la cultura védica sobre la cultura moderna, lo cual me parece muy impráctico y a veces antiproduciente, ya que si la Tierra es plana o redonda no creo tenga trasfondos trascendentales, pero podría hablar de otros temas también. Es un ejemplo nada más. ¿Me podría ayudar a esclarecer más sobre este tema, ya que esto me confunde? Gracias. So he says, I'm an aspiring to Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and sometimes I deal with devotees and aspiring devotees who struggle with the world trying to establish Vedic culture over modern culture, which seems impractical to me and sometimes counterproductive because whether the earth is flat or round, I don't think it has any transcendental implications. And I could mention any other examples. Um, could you help me clarify more about this theme since I'm confused?
Well, first of all, the earth is round.
Por empezar, la Tierra es redonda,
Well, in some places it's flat.
pero en algunos lugares está llana.
But I think it's futile to attempt to establish in our times an ancient culture about which we only have pieces of information, for that matter.
Sorry, you cut off. You said it's futile?
It's futile because,
Okay.
yeah, we only have pieces of information about that culture.
Ujú. Pienso que el esfuerzo de predicar sobre una cultura tan antigua y intentar restablecerla es un esfuerzo fútil.
And the idea that the ancient Vedic culture was perfect in all respects uh, isn't necessarily the case.
Y la idea de que la cultura y el mundo védico eran perfectos en todos respectos no es necesariamente así.
But that it was a culture that in which the ideal and the understanding of everyone was that transcendence was to be attained, that we should live our life in consideration of that primarily.
Pero sí es una cultura donde el ideal y la noción de todo el mundo era la de que hay que trascender, sea lo que sea este mundo, hay que trascenderlo.
And there may be other essential themes that are important to put in place.
Y puede haber unos temas esenciales que es importante, que sería bueno volver a establecer.
Nature of that transcendence, some things about the nature of the world, that things, for example, are here today and gone tomorrow, and so on and so forth.
Por ejemplo, esos temas de la naturaleza, de lo trascendiente, la naturaleza de lo que es este mundo que está aquí ahora y el segundo siguiente todavía no. Esas sí son cosas que es importante establecer.
And obviously, a culture that has such an ideal, behaves in certain ways that are conducive to that, and those ways can be, some of them or a number of them can be incorporated into um, at any time.
Y por supuesto una cultura que cree en esos ideales se comporta de una cierta, o sea, viene con ciertos comportamientos que sería bueno si se volvieran a establecer en la sociedad de hoy.
So with regard to hygiene, cleanliness, um, dress, and so forth, there may be many things from, let's say, the time of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, which is more immediate and historically something that we can know much more about and understand than an ancient Vedic culture. From that culture of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, we may incorporate things. I don't mean to say everyone should wear a dhoti or a sari necessarily, but clothing that's sattvic, that simple, that's not with an emphasis on the body, but it's pragmatic, it's practical, these type of things.
Entonces, con respecto a la limpieza, la higiene, maneras de vestirse, hay cosas que todavía eran corrientes al tiempo de Chaitanya Mahaprabhu y estas sí podemos adoptarlas porque, claro, lo de estar limpios es algo bueno, la manera de vestirse con dhoti, sari no es el tema no es de enfocarse en el cuerpo, sino que son maneras de vestirse bastante prácticas y simples a la misma vez, y estas cosas sí podemos adoptar.
Now, you brought up something with regard to the nature of the natural world.
Ahora, la pregunta era sobre la naturaleza del mundo natural.
And obviously, there's a particular modern scientific perspective on the nature of matter, the cosmos, and so forth, that in many respects appears objectively different than what we find in the Puranas.
Y por supuesto hay una visión del mundo desde el punto de vista de la ciencia moderna y todo eso que parece ser diferente de la descripción del mundo que se encuentra en los Puranas.
But they really, in a broader sense, constitute different ways of looking at the same thing.
Pero en realidad son dos maneras diferentes de ver ver la misma cosa.
Basically, from the Puranic perspective, we look at the external world as something that is a transformation of the gunas, and we call it samsara, and it has an objective. Life in samsara, the objective is to transcend it. That's a very different picture than how modern science or angle of vision from which modern science looks at the world. So they're going to have a different reading of it.
Básicamente la descripción que los Puranas dan del mundo material es la del samsara, o sea que dan alguna descripción, pero al fin y al cabo dicen que es algo que hay que trascender. Y por supuesto es un punto de vista diferente del de la ciencia moderna.
When Parikshit Maharaj asks Sukadeva Goswami at the beginning of the fifth, early on, I should say, maybe the 15th chapter of the fifth canto, it's a long canto, about the nature of the cosmography, Sukadeva, in his initial reply, says that I will reply to you in terms of how the Puranic seers are speaking about it, have spoken about it, but basically it's a transformation, an ongoing transformation of the gunas.
Cuando Parikshit Maharaj le preguntó a Shukadeva Goswami sobre la cosmografía y que le dijera algo sobre el universo, él dijo, te voy a contestar en base a lo que es la visión de los videntes, de los Puranas en este momento, pero básicamente lo que el mundo es una transformación continua de los gunas.
In his comments on this section, Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur says that Parikshit Maharaj asked about the nature of the cosmos, and he did so largely for some of the yogis in the audience.
Su comentario Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur dice que la razón por qué Parikshit Maharaj preguntó sobre el cosmos era más que nada para los yogis que se encontraban entre el público.
Because he had adhikar or eligibility, being a bhakta, to meditate on the form of Krishna. He didn't need to meditate on the world in such a way that it would remind him of God, that it would help him to achieve transcendence. He had the adhikar, the eligibility to meditate on the form of God, but some of the mystic yogis in the audience did not have it. And so Sukadev replied and described the cosmos in the fifth canto in a way that would be conducive for mystic yogis to think about the world, and in the context of doing so, be facilitated in transcending it.
Porque Parikshit Maharaj tenía la calificación para enfocarse en la forma de Krishna y meditar en Dios en su forma personal, pero los yogis necesitaban, o sea, Parikshit Maharaj no necesitaba pensar en el mundo como una manifestación de las energías de Krishna, pero los yogis que estaban entre el público sí necesitaban oír una explicación en ese sentido.
Earlier in the Bhagavatam, in the second canto, Sukadev describes the world in terms of it being like a form of God. The moon, the moon is one eye, the sun is the other. The trees are the hairs on his body. So the Vigarata Rupa, universal form. So this is another way of describing the world, the objective world, what's out there. But the purpose, again, is to describe it in such a way that it will foster the ability to transcend material existence. So consistently, this is the way in which the texts look at the external world, and the way that modern science looks at the external world is different.
Anteriormente se dio en el Bhagavata una descripción del mundo en ese sentido, donde el sol y la luna eran los ojos y lo que se llama Virat Rupa, o sea, la forma universal de Dios. Pero al fin y al cabo es, como dije antes, una conceptualización del mundo para verlo en relación a Dios y con la idea de finalmente trascender esta forma y enfocarse en la forma de Dios mismo. Y claro que el enfoque de la ciencia moderna es todo otra cosa.
So again, in a broader sense, then the preoccupation and focus in the sacred texts is the subjective, the nature of consciousness. And the focus in modern science is the nature of the objective, the quantitative rather than the qualitative. Consciousness is pushed in the background, dismissed, thought to be an epiphenomenon of the brain or something like that has no efficacy on the world itself. So these are very different ways of looking at the world.
Además, el enfoque y el punto de vista de los textos sagrados es subjetivo y todo sobre la conciencia, mientras la ciencia moderna se enfoca en lo cuantitativo en vez que el cualitativo, y midiéndolo todo y poniendo la conciencia, o sea, todo detrás de todo, porque no es, y si sí hablan de la conciencia, la describen como un fenómeno, una what did you call it? AP, what did you call it? AP, the consciousness is described as an AP.
Pardon me?
Epiphenomena. What does material science say about consciousness?
It's an epiphenomenon of the mind that like steam coming off of water that has no efficacy, no influence on the world.
Mientras la ciencia moderna, sí habla de la conciencia, habla de ella como si fuera un epifenómeno de la mente, algo producido por la mente.
It has no efficacy on the world. It's not causal and it doesn't do anything.
Que no tiene ninguna eficacia sobre el mundo, no tiene ninguna.
So these are very So these are very different perspectives.
Entonces son perspectivas muy diferentes.
We tend to be more lean towards idealism, that the objective world is more of an idea than not an idea.
Nosotros tendemos más a un idealismo donde el mundo objetivo es una idea. What do you say? It's an idea more than an idea? What do you say?
More than being an objective thing, its origins. The natural world, the objective world, has its origins in our
Ah, okay, okay.
consciousness.
Ajá. Ah, del punto de vista idealista, donde el mundo objetivo tiene su origen en el mundo de la conciencia.
We don't disagree that there is something objective, but it's like a sea of potentialities that when we interact with it, it causes, it brings about a certain perception of what's out there.
No decimos que no hay nada objetivo, pero sí hay como un mar de potencialidad que donde cualquier objeto material en conexión con la conciencia puede ser percibido de cualquier forma.
So maybe you went to the moon, but maybe you went to the moon inside of an idea that was the moon.
Entonces, puede ser que fuimos hasta la luna, pero puede ser que fuimos a lo que pensábamos que la luna es.
But anyway, point being that there are different angles of vision from which the natural world is being looked at, different descriptions. They don't necessarily have to be in competition with one another.
Pero en general sí hay mucha diferencia entre las dos descripciones y no tienen que ser una contra la otra.
So I wouldn't be very concerned with implementing all aspects of Vedic culture. I don't think anybody can even say what that is. And so devotees tend to pick and choose what they like in terms of their own psychology and what they think is important. And that's hardly a comprehensive cultural replacement for everything that's going on today. Many of things which they do accept and so forth. So.
Por lo que se refiere a la actitud de muchos devotos sobre la cultura védica, en realidad van piscando lo que saben, lo que conocen, lo que se conforma mejor a la psicología de cada uno, pero la realidad es que faltan muchas piezas y por cómo están las cosas hoy día, no es un sistema cultural que pueda sustituir de manera total, que se pueda aplicar a los problemas y a los asuntos de la cultura y de la sociedad de hoy.
So I hope that helps.
Espero que te ayude. Okay, so there's a lot of questions now. Okay, the next one is Bhuvaneshwari Bhavadevi Dasi. ¿Cómo puede entenderse el hecho de que ciertas expansiones de Bhagavan como Mahavishnu y Paramatma no se encuentren rodeadas o controladas por Bhakti, como es en el caso de Sri Krishna? How is it, how are we to understand the fact that some expansions of Bhagavan, such as Mahavishnu and the Paramatma, are not, quote unquote, surrounded or controlled by Bhakti, as it's in the case of Sri Krishna?
Well, Mahavishnu is worshipped by certain types of devotees.
Mahavishnu sí recibe la adoración de un cierto tipo de devotos.
He doesn't have the kind of intimate leelas that Krishna has with those types of devotees.
No tiene la misma intimidad, no tiene lilas con la misma intimidad como los que tiene con sus devotos como Krishna.
It's said that Narayan, despite reveling uh, in bhakti with his devotees in Vaikuntha, has a desire to bestow mukti upon others. And there's no one in Vaikuntha to bestow mukti upon because they're all muktas. And so for this purpose, he expands as Mahavishnu, and there's a world, and in that world there are sadhakas, and Mahavishnu shows compassion to them by liberating them, and they are engaged in his worship.
Se dice que la forma de Mahavishnu corresponde al momento en que Narayan en Vaikuntha siente el deseo de dar su gracia, su misericordia, pero en Vaikuntha no hay nadie que necesite la misericordia del Señor. Entonces se manifiesta como Mahavishnu y por lo tanto el mundo material se manifiesta de él y ahí hay sadhakas donde a quienes él sí puede conceder su misericordia.
So there are always sadhakas in the world, and Mahavishnu expresses himself, Narayan expresses himself, Mahasankarshan, I should say, one of the Chaturvyuha of Vaikuntha, as Mahavishnu, and collects those sadhakas up, so to speak, and then they attain Vaikuntha, and the very form of Mahavishnu contracts into Mahasankarshan, Narayan, and so forth, and they serve him there. So he is surrounded by devotees.
Entonces, Narayan, a través de su expansión de Mahasankarshan, se expande como Mahavishnu, porque en el mundo material siempre hay sadhakas, y les da la liberación, y luego Mahavishnu se, digamos, contrae el mundo y él mismo se reabsorbe en Narayan, y así hay manera de hacerle servicio a Mahavishnu. Él sí está rodeado de devotos.
So if you look at this larger picture, you can see that Mahavishnu is moving within the orbit of Bhakti himself as well.
Entonces, viéndolo así, se ve que sí hay mucho, Bhakti está bastante involucrada hasta con la forma de Mahavishnu.
And there, in the Vaidhi Marg Sampradayas, many of them are worshippers of Mahavishnu.
Y en las sampradayas de Vaidhi Marga hay muchos que son adoradores de Mahavishnu.
It's also said that Mahavishnu has a Vaikuntha planet within the material world. Arjuna went there.
También se dice que Mahavishnu tiene un planeta al interno del mundo material, que es donde fue Arjuna.
So I hope that helps.
Espero que te ayudó. Next one. Mahatma Das from Chile. Reverencia Shri Tripurari Maharaj, antes que todo, muchas gracias por su tiempo. Mi pregunta es en relación al archana adecuado. ¿Cuál es la manera correcta o el bhajan adecuado para la adoración de una Shri Govardhan Shila? ¿En qué humor se desarrolla dicha adoración? My obeisances to Prime Maharaj, first of all, and thanks for your time. My question is in relation to the proper archana. What is the correct way and the correct bhajan to worship a Govardhan Shila, and in what mood is this worship developed?
Govardhan Shila was worshipped by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, and he gave that stone to Raghunath Das Goswami.
La Govardhan Shila era adorada por Chaitanya Mahaprabhu y él le dio esta Shila a Raghunath Das Goswami.
And Raghunath Das Goswami, through Chaitanya Charitamrita, tells us that he saw the stone as non-different from Krishna.
Y a través del Chaitanya Charitamrita, Raghunath Das Goswami nos dice que él vio esta piedra como si no hubiera diferencia entre ella y Krishna.
So he worshiped the stone as Krishna.
Entonces la adoraba así como si fuera Krishna.
This is you could say it's a Ragmarg form of worship.
Alguien podría decir que es una forma de adoración con respecto al Ragamarga.
The ideal of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu as a sadhaka, the ideal of Raghunath Das Goswami as a sadhaka was to attain the Ragmarg and have a place at the feet of Govardhan.
El ideal de Ragamarga era de poner la... Um, you say to put the Shira at the feet of Govardhan?
No, to attain a residence at the foot
Ajá.
of.
El ideal para los devotos en el Ragamarga es de conseguir residencia, por decirlo así, a los pies de Govardhan.
So his is a good example to follow.
Y es un buen ejemplo de seguir.
Mahaprabhu also gave him the Gunjamala. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu used to put this mala around his neck and hold the Shila and bathe him with his tears.
Mahaprabhu también le dio un Gunjamala, que es un collarito hecho de unas vainas, y se lo puso alrededor de la Shila y la bañaba con sus lágrimas.
And he gave the Gunjamala to Raghunath Das. So Raghunath Das thought that the stone is non-different from Krishna. And by giving me Krishna in this form, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has given me the opportunity to have residence at the foot of Govardhan. By giving this Gunjamala, he's given me the opportunity to have that residence at the foot of Govardhan in the service of Radha. Hello? Hello?
Okay, am I there?
Now you are.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was clearing my voice and I muted myself, and then I couldn't mute myself anymore, so I missed what you were saying.
Chaitanya Mahaprabhu used to worship the Govardhan Shila, and he used to garland himself with the Gunjamala. Then he would bathe the deity, the Shila, with his tears. He gave both to Govardhan, both to Raghunath Das. And Raghunath Das thought, I have been given Krishna in the form of Govardhan, significance of which is Chaitanya Mahaprabhu has given me a place in the eternal Leela at the feet of Govardhan. And by giving me the Gunjamala, he's giving me a place at Govardhan in the service of Radhika.
Ajá. Entonces, este mala de vainas, de semillas de gunja, lo llevaba Chaitanya Mahaprabhu cuando adoraba la Shila, bañándola con sus lágrimas. Y él le dio a Raghunath Das Goswami la Shila y este mala de gunja. Y Raghunath Das Goswami lo entendió, entendió el hecho de adorar a una Shila de Govardhan como al acceso a Brajabhakti a través de Govardhan, le dio servicio a los pies de Govardhan y un servicio a través de Radharani, porque es lo que significa el collar de Gunja.
At the same time, Raghunath Das Goswami has written some nice prayers in praise of Govardhan, where he offers prayers to Govardhan, petitioning Govardhan to give him Krishna Bhakti.
Al mismo tiempo, Raghunath Das Goswami escribió muchas oraciones donde él le pedía a Govardhan de darle Brajabhakti.
Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur has said that Govardhan, when seen as a devotee of Krishna, has attained his position as such in Sakyarasa.
Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur dice que cuando se le ve a Govardhan en cuanto un devoto de Krishna, es uno que logró su devoción a Krishna bajo la forma de Sakyarati.
In Rupa Goswami's work, Don Kali, Leela, he also, he describes Govardhan to be like Anantasesh.
En su Dana Keli Lila, Rupa Goswami también describe a Govardhan, lo describe como si fuera Anantashesh.
He has many peaks, like the many hoods of Anantasesh, and like Anantasesh embraces Vishnu and holds him, and similarly, Govardhan embraces Krishna and provides a place for him to engage in so many pastimes.
En esta visión, todas las cumbres de Govardhan son como las cabezas de Anantashesh, y así como Anantashesh abraza a Dios, a Krishna o a Vishnu, y provee para él en todo sentido, también Govardhan le da amparo y todo lo que Krishna necesita.
So from that vantage point, one could say that Govardhan is like Balaram, who is Krishna, who is Vishnu Tattva, but he serves like a devotee of Krishna.
Entonces, viéndolo así, se podría decir que Govardhan es como Balaram, que al fin y al cabo es Krishna, pero en la posición de un devoto de Krishna.
So there are different ways that one can look at Govardhan.
Así que hay muchas maneras de ver, de considerar a Govardhan.
And if one wants to worship him in Madhurya Rasa or in Sakya Rasa, I've given some explanations by which you can understand either one is possible.
Entonces, que uno lo quiera adorar en Madhurya Rasa o en Sakya Rasa, te he dado algunas explicaciones para que cada uno pueda escoger la que más le conviene.
And of course, in the Govardhan Leela, all the Brajbasis worship Govardhan.
Y por supuesto, en el Govardhan Lila, todos los Brajavasis adoran a Govardhan.
But again, here, the Dham is non-different than Krishna himself, and he shows himself to be Govardhan.
Pero es porque el Dhamma no es diferente de Krishna mismo, y él mismo se lo demostró.
But in a sense, Govardhan is a very nice deity to worship in the pursuit of the perfection of sadhana, which in one sense is to attain the full measure of Sharanagati.
La adoración de Govardhana es muy útil en nuestro deseo de desarrollar el Sharanagati.
Sharanagati is the stage on which the drama of Krishna Lila is performed.
El Sharanagati es la escena donde se manifiesta el drama de Krishna Bhakti.
And the center, Swarup Lakshan, the primary characteristic of Sharanagati is the feeling, the sense that Krishna is my maintainer.
Y la primera característica del Krishna Bhakti, de Sharanagati, es que este sentido de que Krishna es el que me sustenta.
So in the Govardhan Leela, Krishna shows himself to be Govardhan, and he shows that Govardhan is maintaining everyone in Braj, not Indra.
En el Govardhan Lila, Krishna asumió esta forma de Govardhan y dándole a entender a los Brajavasis que es él que les da sustentación a los Brajavasis y no Indra.
So there are some different ways to think about Govardhan, and if you want to worship the Govardhan Shila, then you should consult with someone who can help you to focus your particular worship relative to any of the number of things that I've said.
Entonces hay muchas maneras de adorar a Govardhan. Si quieres hacerlo, te sugiero que lo hagas, que consultes a algún Vaishnava que te pueda guiar según el sentimiento que es más, que se acerca más al tuyo.
But I worship the Govardhan Shila, and I garland him with a garland of white gunjamalas.
Pero yo sí
White,
adoré,
it's a mala of white gunja beads.
yo sí adoré Govardhan y hice, la adoración la hacía con un gunjamala de cuentas blancas. You mean the shells, the conch shells?
Yeah, and that garland represents Radha.
Ajá. Y esta guirnalda o collar representa a Radha.
Some persons, some devotees, and we do this at Madhuvan at our ashram, we have black and white shilas from Govardhan. We worship him as Krishna and Balaram.
Hay algunos devotos, como mis devotos en Madhuvan, que adoran a piedras de Govardhan, una blanca y una negra, como si fueran Krishna y Balaram.
So there are different possibilities.
Entonces hay muchas posibilidades.
Do you have any other questions about that?
¿Hay más preguntas sobre eso?
Shyam Sundar? Excuse me, just while I send you one message that there are two questions that I think you should skip because one of them was already made and one of them was already almost answered by Guru Maharaj. So I think you should go to the one made by Bhakti Kavya Tulananda Maharaj.
Okay. I don't see one that's by Tulananda Maharaj. Oh, yeah, there is. Gracias, Maharaj. Quería saber si los Brahmavadis pierden también su individualidad, al igual que los Mayavadis. So Tulananda Maharaj says, thank you, Maharaj. I'd like to know if the Brahmavadis also lose their individuality as well as the Mayavadis.
Mm-hmm. The Mayavadis are a particular sect.
Los Mayavadis son una secta particular.
And they deny the personality, the eternal personality of the Godhead.
Que niega la personalidad eterna de Dios.
But there are others who don't, for whom that's not part of their philosophy, but their ideal is to attain Brahma Sayuja, to merge with Brahman.
Pero hay otros cuyo ideal es el de fundirse con el Brahman, de obtener Brahma Sayuja.
The Mayavadis also teach that there is no Atma, there's only Brahman.
Los Mayavadis también enseñan que no hay Atma, solo hay Brahman.
But there are those who accept that there is an Atma and they want to, if you will, fully identify their Atma with Brahman and enter into Brahma Sayuja.
Pero hay otros que sí reconocen el Atma y que el Atma se puede fundir o unirse al Brahman.
So we disagree with the Mayavadis that there is no Atma, but we do accept that one can attain Brahma Sayuja.
Nosotros no estamos de acuerdo con los Mayavadis que dicen que no existe Atma, pero sí reconocemos que un Atman pueda obtener el Brahma Sayuja.
But also that one can only attain Brahma Sayuja with the help of bhakti.
Pero también decimos que uno solo puede obtener el Brahma Sayuja con la ayuda del Bhakti.
But in Brahma Sayuja, from the Gaudiya perspective, the Atma doesn't turn into Brahman or it doesn't disintegrate or anything like that. So it's still existing.
Pero en el Brahma Sayuja, así como lo conciben los Gaudiyas, no hay una ¿cómo se dice? El Atma no pierde su individualidad.
So in Brahma Sayuja, the Atma rests in Brahman it's fully identified with Brahman, and it has a loss of individual identification, even though each Atma is an individual unit.
Entonces, aún quedándose cada Atma como unidad individual, el Atma está absorto en el Brahman, no tiene ningún deseo individual, pero no pierde su individualidad.
From another vantage point, devotees in Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's Sampradaya, they enter into Krishna Lila, where they're fully identified with the Swarup Shakti, although they are Tatastha Jivas. They cease to identify as Tatastha Jivas, although they are. But because Tatastha Jivas have the capacity to function within the influence of the Swarup Shakti, they do so, and they're fully identified with the Swarup Shakti.
I lost the premise. What did you say in the Chaitanya? Who's thinking this? About who?
Just like the Brahma bodies, if you want to refer to them as such, those who enter Brahma Sayuja, they are Tatastha Shakti. That doesn't change, but they fully identified with Brahman, so they no longer have any sense of their own individual existence as Tatastha Shakti. Similarly, in Gaudiya Vaishnavism, we enter into this Leela under the influence of the Swarup Shakti. We get a form constitutive Swarup Shakti, a mind constitutive Swarup Shakti. We're still the Tatastha Shakti, but we don't identify as the Tatastha Shakti. We identify with the Swarup Shakti.
Entonces hay un paralelo, así como el Atma se absorbe e identifica en el Brahman, pierde sus deseos individuales, sigue siendo Tatastha Shakti, aún no identificándose en ella. Asimismo, los jivas que se absorben en el Swarup Shakti obtienen un cuerpo hecho de Swarup Shakti y no pierden su individualidad, pero tampoco se identifican como Tatastha Shakti. No pierden su individualidad, pero su cuerpo y todo alrededor de ellos está constituido por Swarup Shakti.
Similarly, in material existence, the Tatastha Jiva identifies with the Maya Shakti and really doesn't think it's Tatastha Shakti, thinks it's going to die, and so on and so forth.
Así como cuando el Jiva se identifica con Maya Shakti, no sabe o no piensa que es Tatastha Shakti, sino que se identifica en su realidad material y piensa que va a morir y todo eso.
So one has to understand what it means, Tatastha.
Entonces uno tiene que entender lo que quiere decir Tatastha.
So its identity is largely informed by its environment.
La identidad de uno está en gran parte informada por sus alrededores.
Does that help?
¿Le ayuda? Dice que sí. He says,
Jai
yes.
Maharaj. Swati Kavi Maharaj ki jai.
Entonces ahora voy a tener que ver las preguntas que tengo que leer y las que no. I'm going to need to sort through the questions now.
I think the only remaining one, Shamsundar, is the one from Javat Nandini regarding to something that Guru Maharaj spoke before.
So should I read it?
Sure.
Okay, so Javat Devidasi and Murali M. Das. Jai Maharaj, el que se hable de la tierra plana es que hay devotos que se apoyan en el quinto canto del Srimad Bhagavatam como poder entender bien, sin negar la importancia del Srimad Bhagavatam. Disculpe, mi teclado y audio está malo. Igual me confunde este tema. Puede que me equivoque en el canto en el cual se refieren. Disculpe. So, they say, el que se habla de la tierra. So, as far as people talking about flat earth, it's because there are devotees basing their claim on the fifth canto. without denying the importance of Srimad Bhagavatam. Sorry for my keyboard. Yeah, I'm not sure what the question is. No estoy seguro lo que es la pregunta. Era nada más para especificar que si hay devotos que dicen que la tierra es llana es porque así dice el quinto canto. I'm asking if she was just clarifying that if there are devotees who say that, it's because it says something along those lines in the fifth canto.
Well, let me just say something. There are some devotees that say, based on the fifth canto, that the earth is flat.
Bueno, dejen que diga esto nada más. Hay devotos que dicen que la tierra es llana basado en el quinto canto,
Prabhupada was not one of them.
pero Prabhupada no era uno de ellos.
And that's not necessarily an accurate representation of what the Bhagavatam says. But if it is, and someone can forcefully make that case, I've already replied earlier and stated that the perspective given in the Bhagavatam about the nature of the Bhumandal, for example, is part of the description of the Sukadev's description of the cosmography, which, as he begins his description, says is relative.
Entonces, sí es verdad que el quinto canto del Bhagavatam dice que la tierra es llana, pero no necesariamente representa lo que es la posición del Bhagavatam sobre eso. Y también, como dije antes, sí hay... I think I lost it. You said that even if it says so, it doesn't represent the position of the Bhagavatam. And then it's a different, different points of view. Pero a pesar de todo, el enfoque del Bhagavatam es diferente que el de la ciencia moderna.
The teaching, again, at the very beginning of that section is that this, according to Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur, is a description for mystic yogis. It's not for devotees. Devotees can skip over it.
Entonces, como dijo Shukadev Goswami en el principio, primeramente es la descripción del cosmos, así como se conocía en ese entonces, y además era una descripción para los yogis, los que son devotos, que no le hagan caso para nada.
So devotees should be preoccupied, the teaching there is, with the form of Bhagavan.
Los que son devotos tienen que estar más bien absortos en la forma de Bhagavan.
Not with the details of the nature of the world, whether it's flat or round.
Y no en los detalles de la naturaleza del mundo, que si está llano o redondo.
And the particular description there in the fifth canto is for mystic yogis.
Y esa descripción en particular era para los yogis místicos.
If you're going to talk about it for modern scientists, you might want to talk about it another way.
Se puede describir también para los científicos modernos, o se puede escribir también en cualquier otra forma.
So to think that in order to be faithful to the Bhagavatam, we have to convince ourselves and other people that the world is flat is a very mistaken idea.
Entonces, si pensamos que para que la gente desarrolle fe en el Bhagavatam tenemos que convencerlos de que la tierra está llana, es una idea muy equivocada.
That's not what the book is teaching.
Porque no es esta la enseñanza del texto.
Get your head out of the world and get your head into thinking about the form and qualities of Krishna.
Sino que saquemos nuestra cabeza, nuestra mente de este mundo y que la dirijamos hacia la forma de Krishna y de todo lo que es Krishna.
This type of argument and so-called debate is from the Bhagavatam's own perspective, is a waste of time for devotees.
Este tipo de disertaciones sobre la naturaleza de las cosas, en las palabras mismas del Bhagavatam, es una pérdida de tiempo.
Okay, well, that's my answer. I hope it helps.
Bueno, esta es mi respuesta, espero que le ayudó.
So I think we're out of time, and I hope to be together with you next week.
Creo que se nos acabó el
Jai
tiempo.
Bhagavatam Ki Jai.
Ya, nos vemos la semana siguiente.
Hari Bhakti Ki Jai, Bhakti Vrinda Ki Jai, Gaur Premanande. Hari Bol.
Shri Tripurari Maharaj ki jai.